The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Milbrook as Officer Wilson drove his patrol car through the quiet neighborhoods. It was supposed to be just another ordinary Wednesday, but the small town was buzzing with unusual energy. The Regional Law Enforcement Conference had brought a wave of distinguished visitors to their typically quiet community. Wilson had been with the Milbrook Police Department for 12 years, and he'd grown comfortable with how things worked in his town. Too comfortable, some might say. He took pride in knowing every street corner, every alley, and what he considered to be his people. The influx of outsiders made him uneasy, though he'd never admit it. The conference center, usually host to local business meetings and small gatherings, was now filled with police chiefs and senior officers from across the state. They had gathered to discuss modern policing methods, community engagement, and departmental reforms. Among them were three highly respected police chiefs from major cities, each with decades of experience and numerous accolades for their groundbreaking work in law enforcement. As Wilson parked his car near the conference center, he watched the attendees arriving. Some wore formal uniforms adorned with badges and medals, while others opted for professional casual attire. The sight of so many high-ranking officers in his small town made him grip his steering wheel tighter. This was his territory, and he wasn't about to let anyone, regardless of their rank, change how he did his job. Inside the conference center, the atmosphere was charged with purpose. The main hall buzzed with conversations about body cameras, de-escalation techniques, and community policing programs. The three visiting chiefs sat in the front row, taking notes and occasionally exchanging thoughtful glances. Their presence commanded respect from everyone in the room. Everyone except Officer Wilson, who lingered at the back, arms crossed. During the morning session, one of the chiefs shared statistics about successful community outreach programs in his city. Another discussed how his department had reduced tensions by implementing new training protocols. The third chief spoke passionately about bridging gaps between law enforcement and local communities. Their presentations were met with enthusiastic applause from most attendees. Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as he listened. These big city chiefs didn't understand his town, he thought. They didn't know the streets like he did. They didn't know his way of keeping order. As the morning sessions wrapped up and the lunch break approached, he watched the three chiefs gathering their materials, completely unaware of how their paths would cross in just a few short hours. The conference center slowly emptied as attendees headed out for lunch. Some went to the nearby restaurants, while others chose to explore the historic downtown area. The three chiefs, having heard about Milbrook's charming Main Street, decided to take a walk and see the town for themselves. They removed their official conference badges and blazers, looking forward to a quiet lunch break away from the formal discussions. Little did anyone know that this simple decision, to take a casual stroll through downtown Milbrook, would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the small town to its core and force everyone, especially Officer Wilson, to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their approach to law enforcement. As the chiefs walked out into the warm afternoon sun, Officer Wilson was already in his patrol car, circling the downtown area like a hawk. His 12 years of doing things his way were about to collide head-on with decades of progressive law enforcement experience, and Milbrook would never be the same. The afternoon sun beat down on Milbrook's historic downtown as the three police chiefs strolled along Main Street. They'd left their conference badges behind, wearing casual polo shirts and slacks, looking just like any other visitors admiring the town's charm. The oldest chief, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, pointed out the beautiful Victorian architecture to his colleagues. "These buildings remind me of my hometown," he said, pausing to admire a restored shopfront. His two friends nodded in agreement, their conversation drifting between personal stories and observations about the small town's peaceful atmosphere. None of them noticed Officer Wilson's patrol car slowly cruising by for the third time. Wilson had been watching them since they turned onto Cedar Avenue. In his mind, something didn't add up about these three men walking through what he considered the nice part of town. He'd convinced himself they looked suspicious, though they were doing nothing more than window shopping and chatting. The chiefs stopped outside a family-owned bookstore, discussing whether to grab lunch at the cafe next door. That's when Wilson made his move. He parked his patrol car at an angle near the curb, lights off but engine running. The screech of his brakes drew the attention of several shoppers on the sidewalk. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Wilson called out, his hand resting on his belt as he approached. "Mind telling me what brings you to this neighborhood?" His tone carried an edge that made nearby pedestrians pause and watch. The eldest chief stepped forward with a warm smile. "We're here for the law enforcement conference, officer. Just taking a lunch break and enjoying your beautiful town." He reached for his wallet, ready to show his police ID. "Sure you are," Wilson scoffed, taking an aggressive step forward. "I've been watching you casing these stores for the last 15 minutes. His voice grew louder, drawing more attention from passersby. Some had already pulled out their phones, sensing the situation was about to escalate. The second chief, a decorated veteran with 25 years of service, tried to defuse the situation. "Officer, there seems to be a misunderstanding. We're police chiefs from—" "Put your hands where I can see them," Wilson interrupted, his face reddening. "All of you, spread your legs and face the wall." The absurdity of the situation hadn't yet dawned on him, even as more phones recorded the scene. The third chief, known nationwide for his work in community policing, spoke calmly. "Officer, we're going to comply, but you need to know you're making a serious mistake. We're law enforcement executives attending the conference at the Civic Center." A small crowd had gathered now, including Mrs. Chen from the bookstore, who'd seen the chiefs admiringly discussing books in her window just moments before. "Officer Wilson," she called out, "these men were just looking at my shop. They'd done nothing wrong." But Wilson was too far committed to his mistake. His pride and prejudice had trapped him in a situation that was spinning rapidly out of control. As he reached for his handcuffs, a young woman across the street was already live-streaming the incident, and someone else had run toward the conference center to alert other officers. The three chiefs exchanged knowing looks. They'd spent their careers working to prevent exactly this type of situation. Now, ironically, they found themselves at the center of one. They maintained their dignity and composure, even as Wilson's commands grew more aggressive and his assumptions more apparent. The warm afternoon air grew thick with tension as more residents gathered, their whispers and concerned faces telling a story that would soon spread far beyond the quiet streets of Milbrook. In just a few minutes, Officer Wilson's actions would trigger a chain of events that would force not just him, but the entire town to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the real meaning of protecting and serving. The next few minutes on Main Street played out like a slow-motion scene that nobody could quite believe was real. Officer Wilson, his face now flushed with misplaced authority, began handcuffing the three police chiefs one by one. His hands shook slightly as he did it, though whether from anger or growing uncertainty, no one could tell. "You have the right to remain silent," Wilson recited, his voice carrying across the now hushed street. The eldest chief winced as the handcuffs clicked too tight around his wrists, but he remained dignified, his eyes forward and his expression calm. Nearby, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "But why, Mom? They didn't do anything wrong." The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a loose circle around the scene. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore was now on her phone, frantically calling the police station. A teenager who worked at the ice cream shop next door had climbed onto a bench to get better footage of the incident. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. "Officer," the second chief spoke quietly as Wilson grabbed his arm, "think about what you're doing. Check our credentials. Make the phone call. You still have time to handle this professionally." But Wilson was beyond listening. His pride had built a wall around his reason, and each passing second only made it harder for him to back down. As Wilson moved to handcuff the third chief, a police radio crackled to life from somewhere in the crowd. An off-duty officer from a neighboring county, who had been shopping with his family, had called it in. Dispatch, we have a situation on Main Street. Officer needs assistance, but not for the reason he thinks. The sound of distant sirens began to float through the air. Wilson's face showed the first flicker of doubt, but he pressed on, roughly guiding the three chiefs toward his patrol car. The vehicle seemed too small for this moment, too ordinary for the extraordinary mistake unfolding in broad daylight. These men were just in my store, Mrs. Chen called out, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. They were talking about buying books for their grandchildren. Other voices joined in, a chorus of witnesses to Wilson's mounting error in judgment. The chiefs maintained their composure even as Wilson struggled to fit them into the back of his patrol car. Their dignity in the face of this injustice spoke volumes about their character and experience. They'd seen this scenario play out countless times in their careers, but never imagined they'd be on this side of it. A young reporter from the local paper happened to be getting coffee nearby when she noticed the commotion. She arrived just in time to capture Wilson closing the patrol car door, her notebook already out as she interviewed shocked witnesses. He wouldn't even look at their IDs, one man told her, shaking his head in disbelief. The sirens were getting closer now. 2 more patrol cars turned onto Main Street, followed by an unmarked vehicle with emergency lights. Wilson's proud stance began to waver as he recognized the car of his direct supervisor, Lieutenant Rivera. The lieutenant had been at the conference all morning, listening to these very same chiefs share their expertise. As Wilson reached for his radio to call in the arrest, his hand froze halfway. Through his windshield, he could see more police vehicles arriving, and familiar faces from the conference emerging from them. The realization of what he had done was finally starting to dawn on him, creeping across his face like a slow-moving shadow. Inside the patrol car, the 3 chiefs sat in uncomfortably close quarters, their years of combined experience and wisdom confined by metal and prejudice. But they knew something Wilson didn't. This moment, as difficult as it was, would become a powerful catalyst for change. The very thing they had been discussing at the conference was now playing out in real time on the streets of Milbrook. The next few minutes on Main Street played out like a slow-motion scene that nobody could quite believe was real. Officer Wilson, his face now flushed with misplaced authority, began handcuffing the 3 police chiefs one by one. His hands shook slightly as he did it, though whether from anger or growing uncertainty, no one could tell. "You have the right to remain silent," Wilson recited, his voice carrying across the now hushed street. The eldest chief winced as the handcuffs clicked too tight around his wrists, but he remained dignified, his eyes forward and his expression calm. Nearby, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "But why, Mom? They didn't do anything wrong." The growing crowd of onlookers had formed a loose circle around the scene. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore was now on her phone, frantically calling the police station. A teenager who worked at the ice cream shop next door had climbed onto a bench to get better footage of the incident. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows that seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment. "Officer," the second chief spoke quietly as Wilson grabbed his arm, "think about what you're doing. Check our credentials. Make the phone call. You still have time to handle this professionally." But Wilson was beyond listening. His pride had built a wall around his reason, and each passing second only made it harder for him to back down. As Wilson moved to handcuff the 3rd chief, a police radio crackled to life from somewhere in the crowd. An off-duty officer from a neighboring county, who had been shopping with his family, had called it in. "Dispatch, we have a situation on Main Street. Officer needs assistance, but not for the reason he thinks." The sound of distant sirens began to float through the air. Wilson's face showed the first flicker of doubt, but he pressed on, roughly guiding the 3 chiefs toward his patrol car. The vehicle seemed too small for this moment, too ordinary for the extraordinary mistake unfolding in broad daylight. "These men were just in my store," Mrs. Chen called out, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. They were talking about buying books for their grandchildren. Other voices joined in, a chorus of witnesses to Wilson's mounting error in judgment. The chiefs maintained their composure even as Wilson struggled to fit them into the back of his patrol car. Their dignity in the face of this injustice spoke volumes about their character and experience. They'd seen this scenario play out countless times in their careers, but never imagined they'd be on this side of it. A young reporter from the local paper happened to be getting coffee nearby when she noticed the commotion. She arrived just in time to capture Wilson closing the patrol car door, her notebook already out as she interviewed shocked witnesses. He wouldn't even look at their IDs, one man told her, shaking his head in disbelief. The sirens were getting closer now. 2 more patrol cars turned onto Main Street, followed by an unmarked vehicle with emergency lights. Wilson's proud stance began to waver as he recognized the car of his direct supervisor, Lieutenant Rivera. The lieutenant had been at the conference all morning, listening to these very same chiefs share their expertise. As Wilson reached for his radio to call in the arrest, his hand froze halfway. Through his windshield, he could see more police vehicles arriving, and familiar faces from the conference emerging from them. The realization of what he had done was finally starting to dawn on him, creeping across his face like a slow-moving shadow. Inside the patrol car, the 3 chiefs sat in uncomfortably close quarters, their years of combined experience and wisdom confined by metal and prejudice. But they knew something Wilson didn't. This moment, as difficult as it was, would become a powerful catalyst for change. The very thing they had been discussing at the conference was now playing out in real time on the streets of Milbrook. The morning after the incident, Milbrook's police department buzzed with activity. Internal affairs investigators had arrived early, setting up in a borrowed conference room that smelled of fresh coffee and tension. Stacks of personnel files covered the long table, with Wilson's record front and center. "Look at this," one investigator said, pointing to a complaint from 2 years ago. A black family reported being followed through the Heritage District for 3 blocks. The complaint had been marked resolved with barely an investigation. As they dug deeper, more patterns emerged from the paperwork like threads in a troubling tapestry. In another room, tech specialists combed through Wilson's body camera archives. Hours of footage revealed a disturbing trend. Different tones of voice for different people, selective enforcement, subtle discriminations that had gone unchecked for years. A young officer watching the footage shook her head, remembering times she'd noticed something off but hadn't spoken up. The mayor sat in his office, blinds drawn, reviewing citizen complaints from the past 5 years. His assistant had compiled them into a thick binder, color-coded by type of incident. Too many yellow tabs marked potentially biased encounters. "How did we miss this?" he muttered, running his hands through his gray hair. Lieutenant Rivera interviewed officers who'd worked alongside Wilson. Their stories painted a picture of small moments that should have raised red flags. He always volunteered to patrol the East Side festivals. One officer recalled, uncomfortable with the memory, said he knew how to handle those people better than anyone else. At the local coffee shop, Mrs. Chen met with other business owners from Main Street. They shared stories about Wilson, times they'd seen him following certain customers, questioning delivery workers without cause, making people feel unwelcome in their own town. "We all saw it," the bakery owner admitted, stirring his coffee endlessly. "We just didn't want to make waves." The 3 chiefs had returned to their cities but stayed deeply involved. They turned down offers from national news shows, preferring to work quietly with Milbrook's leadership. Their departments sent over training materials, policy documents, and expert advisors. What had started as a crisis was becoming a masterclass in police reform. Back at the station, the police chief discovered Wilson's old performance reviews. Buried in the praise for his proactive policing were warnings never heeded. Notes about overenthusiasm in certain neighborhoods, comments about cultural sensitivity needed. The chief felt the weight of these overlooked signs settling on his shoulders. Community members began coming forward with their own stories. A high school teacher shared security footage of Wilson confronting students of color in the parking lot. A retired postal worker described years of random traffic stops. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that should have been solved long ago. The investigation revealed more than just Wilson's actions. It exposed a system of silent acceptance. Good people who saw warning signs but looked away. Department policies that allowed bias to hide behind procedure. Training programs that never went deep enough to create real change. In the evidence room, interview transcripts piled up next to data analysis reports. The numbers told their own story. Disproportionate stops, questionable searches, patterns that couldn't be explained away by coincidence. Each statistic represented real people, real moments when the badge had been used to intimidate rather than protect. As the sun set on another long day of investigation, Lieutenant Rivera looked out his office window at the town he'd sworn to protect. Pairs of investigators walked their cars, carrying boxes of evidence and hours of interviews. Tonight, in homes across Milbrook, dinner conversations would center on change, not just of one officer, but of an entire system that had allowed this moment to become inevitable. 2 weeks after the incident, Wilson sat in a small classroom at the State Police Training Center. The three chiefs had surprised everyone by recommending rehabilitation over termination. Now, surrounded by training manuals and self-reflection exercises, Wilson was beginning to understand why they'd made that choice. "Think back to your first day as an officer," the instructor said to the small group. "Remember why you chose this career." Wilson closed his eyes, remembering the proud smile on his mother's face at his graduation. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of that early idealism, letting bias and pride cloud his judgment. Back in Milbrook, changes were already taking shape. The police station's break room had been converted into a community meeting space where officers and residents gathered for weekly discussions. Mrs. Chen from the bookstore had become a regular attendee, bringing cookies and honest conversations about how to rebuild trust. The department's new training program, designed with help from the three chiefs, went beyond traditional sensitivity sessions. Officers spent time working in community centers, learning the stories behind the faces they encountered on patrol. They studied successful cases of community policing from across the country, seeing how other departments had transformed their relationships with the public. Wilson's own transformation became a daily journey. Each morning, he met with a mentor, a retired officer who'd gone through his own awakening years ago. They talked about ingrained habits, unconscious biases, and the courage it takes to admit when you're wrong. "The hardest part," his mentor told him, "is facing yourself in the mirror each morning and choosing to be better." The local high school invited Wilson to join a student-led forum on police relations. He sat quietly at first, listening to young people share their experiences and fears. When it was his turn to speak, his voice shook slightly. "I'm here to learn," he said, "and to show you that people can change when they open their hearts to understanding." In the police station, new policies took effect. Body camera footage was reviewed weekly by a community panel. Officers rotated through different neighborhoods, preventing the territorial attitudes that had contributed to the incident. The department's motto, "Protect and Serve," was repainted on the wall with an addition: "Protect, serve, and understand." The three chiefs kept their promise to help, sending training materials and conducting virtual workshops. Their departments became sister agencies to Milbrook, creating exchange programs where officers could learn from each other's experiences. What had started as a crisis was becoming a model for other small towns looking to modernize their police forces. Wilson's progress surprised many, including himself. The angry defensiveness of those first days had given way to genuine reflection. He spent off-duty hours volunteering at community centers, learning the stories of families who'd lived in Milbrook for generations. Each conversation helped him see the town through new eyes. Local businesses noticed the change too. Officers now stopped by shops to chat with owners, learning their names and concerns. The ice cream shop where that fateful video had been recorded became a favorite spot for community police meetings, its owner proud to host conversations about positive change. At a department meeting, Wilson stood up to share his experience with fellow officers. "I thought I knew this town," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "But I was only seeing what my biases let me see. Real protection means serving everyone equally, and I learn more about what that means every day." The transformation wasn't just about policies and procedures, it was about hearts and minds. As Wilson left the training center each evening, he passed a wall of photos showing graduating police classes through the years. Now he saw them differently, understanding that behind each badge was a responsibility not just to enforce the law, but to help build a community where everyone feels protected and respected. 6 months after the incident that changed Milbrook forever, the town's conference center was once again filled with police officers from across the state. This time, the atmosphere was different. The 3 chiefs who had once been wrongfully arrested stood at the podium, but now they were there to celebrate progress. The morning sun streamed through the windows as the eldest chief addressed the crowd. 6 months ago, we experienced firsthand what needed to change. Today, we're here to share how one town's mistake became a blueprint for transformation. In the audience, Wilson sat quietly, his new role as a department trainer still feeling both challenging and right. The changes in Milbrook had exceeded everyone's expectations. Crime rates had dropped, not through aggressive policing, but through improved community relationships. Local teenagers who once avoided officers now participated in police-sponsored youth programs. The department's social media showed officers attending community events, coaching Little League games, and helping elderly residents with groceries. Mrs. Chen stood up to share her story, her bookstore now a regular stop for officer community reading programs. "Last week," she said, smiling, "Officer Wilson helped me host a children's story hour." The same children who saw his mistakes 6 months ago now see his commitment to change. The audience nodded, understanding the power of such small but significant moments. The police chief presented data showing the impact of their new policies. Traffic stops had become more equitable, complaint numbers had plummeted, and community satisfaction scores had soared. But the real success stories came from the officers themselves, who spoke about their transformed relationships with the community they served. Wilson's turn to speak came near the end of the conference. He stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had once judged him and now waited to learn from his experience. 6 months ago, I was the example of what was wrong with policing, he began. Today, I want to be an example of how we can change when we're willing to learn. He shared specific moments from his journey, the first community meeting where he truly listened, the teenager who taught him about their fears during a youth forum, the elderly couple who invited him for dinner to share stories about the town's history. Each moment had chipped away at his old mindset, replacing bias with understanding. The bakery owner who had once watched Wilson's discriminatory behavior now proudly supplied treats for police community events. "The difference is in the small things," she told a reporter. "Officers know our names now. They ask about our families. They're part of our community, not just people who patrol it." As the conference concluded, the 3 chiefs announced a new statewide initiative, inspired by Milbrook's transformation. Their departments would help other towns implement similar changes, creating a network of reformed police departments committed to true community service. The youngest chief pointed to Wilson in the audience. "Real change happens when we're brave enough to admit our mistakes and humble enough to learn from them." Officer Wilson could have become another cautionary tale. Instead, he became proof that transformation is possible. Outside the conference center, life in Milbrook continued its new normal. Officers chatted with shop owners during their walks through downtown. Kids waved at patrol cars instead of avoiding them. The police station's community room hosted daily meetings between officers and residents, their conversations building bridges that had once seemed impossible. Wilson's last stop that day was at the ice cream shop where his mistake had been captured on video. Now, 6 months later, he sat sharing ice cream with a group of rookie officers, teaching them what he'd learned about true community policing. The shop owner, who had once feared calling the police, now considered them regular customers and friends. As the sun set on Milbrook, the town stood as living proof that even the darkest moments could lead to positive change. The incident that could have divided them had instead united them, creating a model of policing that put community first. What started as one officer's mistake had grown into a movement, proving that real change begins with the courage to admit wrongs and the commitment to make them right.